Hello and welcome to the Learning Hub's workshop on avoiding plagiarism, also known as the Academic Integrity Policy Workshop. My name is Sarah Collins and I am the writing coordinator in the Learning Hub, and I'm here today to walk you through the Academic Integrity Policy, what academic integrity means, and most importantly, how to avoid plagiarism in your writing. First, I will mention that we have an academic integrity policy here on this campus. Most universities, if not all of them, have some variation of an academic integrity policy. And in short, we have this policy in order to strengthen, quote from the policy, the university's commitment to academic excellence. This is a policy in place to ensure that all students, faculty, staff, anyone who is a part of our campus upholds academic excellence. It's very serious, it's something we take very seriously, and so therefore violations are also taken seriously, not only because they harm the violator and other students, but also the university as a whole. The reputation suffers as a result of individuals' violations, and so again, we take it very, very seriously here. Something we like to talk about in the Learning Hub is that when most students hear the phrase academic integrity, they often immediately associate it with something bad, with I shouldn't do that, I need to be careful, I could get in trouble. And that's true because, again, as I just said, violations are taken very seriously. But it's important to sort of reframe your understanding of academic integrity because as a whole, as a core, academic integrity is a good thing. The violations are bad, but that's because it is so important that we follow and practice academic integrity in our work. And so we like to talk through some of those benefits of academic integrity to try to do that work of reframing it in your head. First, academic integrity is important because it helps you provide credibility when you name drop in your work. If you were to quote from, say, Stephen Hawking in your paper about black holes, that's going to provide you with credibility, so it looks like you know what you're talking about. If you just start using random information without showing where it came from, you're losing out on that credibility it can provide you. Secondly, it puts your work in context and shows who puts ideas forth and when. It connects your writing, your ideas, to the larger network of scholars and experts on that material, that web of sources. And so it is very important to practice proper academic integrity, showing all of the sources and where they came from so that you yourself become a part of that conversation. It might seem weird as a student when you turn things in, you don't normally think of it as being accessed by other people as actual research, but the practice of academic integrity also allows readers to access your sources for further study if it's something they would be interested in learning more about. Again, as a student, this may seem foreign, but many people who publish papers and books and articles end up having their sources reviewed by other people. It's called citation mining, where they'll go to that work's reference list and say, ooh, that looks interesting, I'm going to put that on my list to read about later. And so as a student practicing academic integrity, you are again practicing that step of helping the people who read your work learn more about the topic if they'd like to by showing where you got the ideas from. And then lastly, practicing good academic integrity also is going to prepare you for the professional world. You are not only expected to be ethical in where you get your information from and how you present it in your own work. As a student, you also are expected to practice that same credibility and ethics and morality in your work as a young professional. I often tell a story at this point about my husband, who is a software developer, and he came home one day from work and seemed a little upset. And when I asked him what was going on, he said he had been in a meeting with a coworker earlier in the day talking about this certain program or this process that they were frustrated with. And my husband said, well, what if we tried this, and had an idea for what they could do to make it more efficient. And at the time in that meeting, the coworker shrugged it off and said, oh no, that doesn't sound like it would work. That sounds like a bad idea. But later, that coworker went to their boss, their supervisor, and said, hey, I had this idea for how we might streamline this process or program, whatever it was, and effectively stole my husband's idea. And he found out later when his boss said, "Hey, so and so came up with this great idea. We should all congratulate them for their good thinking work." And so effectively got his work, his ideas plagiarized. And so it is important to not be that coworker and to practice good communication skills and to give credit where credit is due, even in the work that you do in the workforce beyond college. So this is just a short list of all the many different benefits that come with practicing good academic integrity. So again, to think of it in terms of a good thing when it's done well, try to think of it that way. So as a student, therefore, you do have some responsibilities that you need to follow to be in line with the academic integrity policy. The first of which is to adhere to the policy, to make sure you're following the rules, not violating in the various ways you can violate the policy. Now, if you haven't read the policy, first of all, I would recommend that you go and you read it. It's not very long and it provides a lot of really crucial information for how you can be successful in practicing academic integrity. But secondly, if you haven't read it, that doesn't excuse you from violations and from getting in trouble for not following the policy. So therefore, you need to make sure you're asking the appropriate questions, to follow directions, and make sure that you're doing everything you can to maintain academic integrity in your work. Different people that you should be asking questions of would include your professors, the ones who built the assignments and your courses, and so they understand and know what their expectations are, but also the Learning Hub. We are here to help you navigate that academic integrity stuff. We are happy to be sort of a plagiarism checker for you, make sure that nothing that we see looks suspicious, and can sort of be a safety net in place to catch those violations before they occur. We consider anything that comes through our doors to be a work in progress. We do not turn in students for academic integrity violations ourselves. And so again, if you bring in something to us and it is plagiarized, or it does appear to have some cheating or some misrepresentation of sources or whatever it is, we will just simply explain to you why it's wrong and what you can do to fix it. So do treat us as a primary support resource for you in navigating the academic integrity policy and how to follow it. We're a good space to ask those questions. At the end of the day, though, your primary responsibility as a student is to help build a community at UIS where academic integrity is upheld and respected, to help us be a campus with a good reputation that does good work. Specifically, we in this workshop focus on plagiarism. It is the primary way to violate the academic integrity policy in a writing context. There are many other ways. There's about 8 different violation types listed in the policy, including cheating, misrepresenting your academic record, and things like that. And I would encourage you to again, take a look at the policy and read it so you understand what's going on. But specifically, like I said, we will be focusing on plagiarism because it's the one that's most closely associated with writing, and we're all writing people up in the hub, on the Writing Center side anyway. So what is plagiarism? At the core, plagiarism entails intellectual theft, which sounds really serious, and it is. It's why we take violations of the policy so seriously here. In short, though, what that means is the failure to reference the ideas and words of others appropriately and accurately. Would be the added words onto that definition. Any submitted work that you provide to your professors should be your own, and should properly acknowledge any ideas, facts, or words that you pull from other places. We here in the United States consider intellectual property to be a very important thing, which means that people can own ideas, they can own words that have been published. Copyright law, trademark law, those sorts of things matter here very much. And that becomes the core of why plagiarism is such a big deal, because you are not doing everything in your power to show what ideas come from other places than your own brain, and where specifically that information comes from through citation and other means. So in short, that's what plagiarism refers to. Some examples, therefore, of plagiarism. It isn't just copying and pasting something from Wikipedia and putting it in your paper. That is plagiarism. but there are many other ways that plagiarism can occur. So we like to kind of give a sense of what they are. Before talking about these individual examples, I will mention that plagiarism can be both unintentional and intentional. Just because you didn't know that you plagiarized doesn't excuse the behavior. You can still violate the policy. It's the same as not knowing what the speed limit is, but getting pulled over and getting a ticket because you were speeding. It doesn't, ignorance of the law doesn't protect you from the law, sort of thing. So, some examples of unintentional plagiarism might include this first bullet point, using the words, pattern, structure, or organization of an author's argument or ideas without proper citation. So you may have forgotten to put quotation marks around a quote. You might have forgotten to put a citation in the right place after a quote or a paraphrase, or you maybe put the wrong information. You didn't follow the formatting guidelines for the citation style you're using. Whatever it might be, there's just not correct, adequate citation for materials that were pulled from other places. An example of intentional plagiarism might be altering source material, including the data, ideas, dates, page numbers, or whatever it might be from the source material in a way that will fit the paper's ideas better. So you have a quote and it's a really good quote, but if you just added the word not in there, it would then fit your own paper. Or if the dates weren't recent enough and so you just fudge the dates so it makes it seem more relevant. Or your professor specifically told you not to quote from the first couple of pages and so you just fudge the page number so it looks like it comes from later in the source. All of that, all of those choices are intentional choices you're making to mislead your reader as far as the quality and content of your source material. And so that's a big no-no. That's absolutely considered plagiarism because you are misrepresenting what that source material says. Another example would be buying a paper off of the internet. Very clearly there's some intentional malice with an act like that. Having someone else write your paper for you, family member, or again, someone you purchased their services. All of that is very dishonest and would be considered intentional plagiarism and would receive even higher consequences than something like forgetting to put quotation marks in your work. One other example of plagiarism, by the way, that often we get some colorful commentary from students when we give a workshop and talk about this, so I'll mention it briefly. You can actually self-plagiarize. If you submit a part or an entire work of something you wrote previously for another class, for a class you're taking now, without the permission of both the professor from the previous class and your current professor, you are self-plagiarizing. You are not allowed to use the same paper twice. You can potentially use ideas from it, maybe quote a sentence or two to help you make a point in a new paper, but you would need to quote from yourself, meaning you need to cite yourself. And you, again, would need permission to do so because that may or may not be an appropriate source for the assignment that you're being asked to write in this new class. So just try to do all new work for all new classes and make sure you're using all of your source material appropriately. We do like to talk through what happens if you are caught violating the policy. We have a very specific system here at UIS that I think is worth going over because some students don't really understand how it works here. So hopefully this is helpful context for you. Here at UIS we have what we call a tiered system. We have Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And they escalate from the least serious up to the most serious types of violations and therefore the most serious consequences. Basically how it works is if your professor is checking over your assignment and noticed that you plagiarized or cheated or in some way violated the policy, they will then fill out some paperwork. There are two forms that get filled out. The first one is called the prior violation report form. And the professor fills that out and sends it to the Academic Integrity Council. The representative from the council will then look up your record and see if you have any prior violations on your account. If you don't, then they will send the form back saying, nope, this would be the student's first violation. If you do, they would report back saying they do have a prior violation in this category. Again, there's 7 or 8 different categories of violation types in the policy. From that point, the professor then fills out the academic integrity violation report form. And armed with the information from the first form about whether you have a previous violation or not, that then allows them to fill out the violation report form for this instance accurately. If it's your first violation ever, or the first violation of that type, so it's your first plagiarism instance, even though you maybe got caught cheating before, or vice versa, most professors will fill out the form under the Tier 1 category. Tier 1 is the least serious. It's meant to be treated as a learning situation for you to learn from your mistakes and then not repeat them in the future. And they often carry the least serious consequences, which include a reduction in grade or a failing grade for the assignment. Sometimes it also means coming into the Learning Hub to do our Avoiding Plagiarism workshop, which maybe is the reason why you're here. An instructor may select Tier 2 as the violation type if this is not the student's first violation, so they've been caught plagiarizing or cheating before, or if what they did is severe enough to merit escalating it beyond Tier 1. The consequences that an instructor might decide for a Tier 2 case could include a reduction in grade or a failing grade for the course, not just the assignment. Both Tier 1 and Tier 2, like I said, are handled by the instructor and the student in a meeting where they get together and the instructor goes over what they found and what they plan to do. And the student and the instructor then sign off on that documentation, which then goes to the council, and then the consequences are pursued from there. However, as a student, you do have the right to decline to sign that form, in which case it automatically escalates to a Tier 3, which is the hearing stage. An instructor may also decide to escalate a violation to a Tier 3 if what the student did is egregious enough that it would be beyond the scope of a Tier 1 or a Tier 2 violation. So for instance, buying a paper off the internet or something of that nature. The hearing stage is where a panel of faculty and students is called to meet on a day and time when you and the professor would go in and each get to explain your case, and with the case heard by both parties, that hearing panel then decides what happens from there. They could choose to uphold the professor's findings and whatever punishments the professor deemed necessary. They could side with the student and drop the violation and any consequences for the action. They could decide that the professor was right in their findings but impose a harsher penalty. It all depends on each case. But this is where the tier where we see harsher penalties for a violation being found to have happened. This is where suspension or dismissal from the university could occur. This is where transcript notations, marks on your record occur. And this could even include things like removing a student from a leadership position on campus if they are an athlete or if they're part of a student club or something of that nature. So we do see some pretty serious consequences as a result of Tier 3 hearings. Now that we've talked through the academic integrity policy and plagiarism and what it means and how violations work at UIS, let's start to talk about how to be more ethical and practicing academic integrity in your writing, how to avoid plagiarism. First, let's talk about when you should cite information. That's one of the things that some students struggle with is when should I make sure I'm including citation information versus when can I get by with just saying something without having to refer to a source. Generally speaking, you do not need citations for what we say is common knowledge, and I'm putting that in air quotes because common knowledge can be actually quite tricky to decide. Common knowledge refers to what the average person can be reasonably expected to know. That is hard to say. Not everyone has the same life experiences, education, understanding of the world, and so just because you may know something from your own previous life experience doesn't mean that it is in fact common knowledge. We all have weird fascinations with things, that we have a lot of knowledge that many people don't, and so we can't consider that to be common knowledge necessarily. We may in fact need to go find a source to corroborate that information. So some examples of common knowledge are the following. Well-known dates of events in history. July 4th is the United States Independence Day. Christmas is on December 25th. Well-known phrases. This one's a little tricky. Most people think of things like to be or not to be, the graphic on this slide. But in fact, to be or not to be is attributable. That comes from William Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And so if you use that phrasing in your writing, you do in fact need to cite it. It is a well-known phrase, but it comes from somewhere very specific, somewhere that was published. So that's not quite what we mean by well-known phrases. What we mean is something like to kill two birds with one stone. Those sorts of idioms, phrases that we have in our language that we don't really know where they came from, but they're really specific and mean something really specific. But those we would consider to not really require citation because everyone uses them. They've been around so long that we aren't even sure who we might attribute that phrase to. Another thing would be common geographical information. Springfield is the capital of Illinois. The Grand Canyon is in Arizona. The names of famous people and some of their most famous accomplishments. Barack Obama was the President of the United States. Dr. Stephen Hawking, famous astrophysicist, things like that. And then sensory knowledge, which is the knowledge you get from your five senses. So snow is cold, candy is sweet, the sun is bright, those kinds of things. All of those can be reasonably expected to be common knowledge where you wouldn't need to include citation for that. Anything beyond that, though, you do need to provide citation. And this is where it gets tricky because many students will think, well, I know that, so that is a date in history that most people know, but it may not be the case. And so even though you know it, doesn't mean that it doesn't still need a citation. You still need to go find a source to corroborate that information so that your reader can trust that the information you are providing is accurate. So some examples of things that would need citation that are less than common knowledge would be obscure dates of events in history. The Chicago Cubs won the World Series in 1908. And then 108 years later, won it in 2016. That's might be fairly common knowledge that they won it recently, but the specific years would probably need a citation. Less known phrases, again, anything that is attributable, that comes from somewhere specific, that was published, does need to be cited. Uncommon geographical information, the unknown soldier grave in DC, some national parks aren't as well known, things like that. The accomplishments of well-known people, we have Shirley Chisholm in the graphic here, who was elected as the first African-American Congresswoman in 1968. Everyone should know that, but that would not necessarily meet the threshold of common knowledge because many people don't know who our first African American Congresswoman was. And then anything that is considered intellectual property, anything that is the ideas of an individual or a group of people that was published in some way with them as the author of that material. That information would need to be cited. So with that discussion out of the way about common knowledge versus less than common knowledge, let's talk about the different ways that you can include source information in your writing. There are three primary ways to do that. You have summary, paraphrase, and quotation. We're going to talk about each of these and specifically define them and give you some examples so that you know what they are, why you would choose to use one in a certain context over the other, and specifically how you might do that so that you're avoiding plagiarism. At this point in the workshop, I do like to ask students, okay, what does a summary mean to you? How would you define a summary and why is it different than a paraphrase or a quotation? Since I don't have a captive audience and I'm recording this workshop, I will explain that a summary and a paraphrase are two modes of using information from source material where you are taking information from the source and then putting it in your own words to then mesh with your writing in your paper. A quotation is where you take the words from a source and you put them in your writing as the author intended, the way the author wrote them. The difference between a summary and a paraphrase, though, is the amount of information that you pull from that source. So in a summary, You are taking the big picture, the entire book, an entire section of the book, the bigger picture ideas, the main ideas of that source. We're not yet getting into the nitty gritty sentence level material. So you would use a summary for a few different reasons. You would do that if a quotation or a paraphrase would give unnecessary details and you just need to get across the author's main idea from their text. Or if several different kinds of information from the same source are provided over several pages, they might build their main idea, their argument, over the course of multiple chapters, and so you have to pull the snippets of summary of each of those main ideas to show how it builds into the conclusions that the author draws by the end of their work. So that's when a summary would be a good idea. A paraphrase then is when you take a smaller amount of information from the source, like a sentence or a couple of sentences at the most, and you take that information, that material, and you rework it into your own words to then, again, mesh with your own writing. Now, a paraphrase is a very difficult thing to master, and I would say that a good chunk of the students that come in to see us for violations of the policy are coming in because they are not sufficiently paraphrasing the material they're pulling from their sources. Many students think, oh, I can just change a couple of words and that's going to be enough to paraphrase. But that is not what a paraphrase is. A good paraphrase fully changes the syntax and the diction, meaning the word choice, the diction, and the word order, the syntax. So students who want to paraphrase in their work need to take that material and completely reimagine it so that it's not recognizable as the same source with just a couple of words changed. It takes a lot more work to paraphrase sufficiently, so students need to be aware of that. When you would paraphrase versus summarize or quote is if you need to discuss the details from the source. So a summary is, again, big picture, but if you want to get into the weeds of your source, then paraphrasing would be more appropriate. But you want to paraphrase instead of quote because the ideas and facts are more important than the language used to describe them, or if a quotation might be distracting. Sometimes the original text might use language that differs substantially in the style or the tone from your writing. And rather than having this jarring transition from your particular style of writing to this other author's mode of writing, you rework it into your own style so everything flows a little bit better. Sometimes you paraphrase because professors require paraphrasing. There are some professors and some disciplines, some majors, where students can only paraphrase. They're not allowed to quote. And so if you're in one of those programs, it's very important that you understand that threshold of what makes a good paraphrase and that you always stay above that threshold. You never fall too short of creating good paraphrases because, again, that's one of the primary reasons why we see people for violations of the academic integrity policy in the Learning Hub. Lastly, we have quotations, and I mentioned that a quotation is when you take the wording from a source and you put it word for word exactly as it appeared in your own writing. Now, quotations do have specific formatting guidelines. You have to put quotation marks around them. If you change the wording at all, you have to reflect that through the ... ellipses or brackets for adding words. There's lots and lots of rules that go into using quotes, and we have handouts in the Learning Hub that can provide you with that context. We're also happy to discuss that with you in a one-on-one appointment. But to talk about why you would quote versus paraphrasing or summary, again, if you're using a quote, you're getting into the weeds, you're using the specific information, and so a summary isn't really appropriate because that's looking at the big picture, so you would quote to provide detail. But you would quote versus paraphrase for a few different reasons. Maybe the exact language that the author used will support your ideas better than a summary or paraphrase. We hear sometimes from students that the author just said it the way that they said it. Like, I wouldn't attempt to paraphrase that because I wouldn't know how else to say it. Sometimes the language that the author uses is particularly interesting, striking, or nuanced, Or maybe you plan to spend time analyzing the author's words, in which case it doesn't make sense to provide a paraphrase and then talk about the quote. You need to provide the quote to talk about the quote. And then another reason is if the author of your text is a particular expert in their field, if they're a highly respected authority, it's a really good idea to try not to reword what they wrote. I personally wouldn't feel comfortable paraphrasing Dr. Stephen Hawking, for example. I'm going to let him speak for himself and use quotes of his work. So these are some of the reasons why you would summarize, paraphrase, or quote. And hopefully that gives you an idea of which tactic you might use depending on the writing situation and the type of research you're trying to use alongside your writing. So here we have examples of each of them. One thing I will mention briefly is that you might notice that in all of these examples, we are providing citation information regardless of the type. So if it's a summary, you still need a citation. If it's a paraphrase, you still need a citation. And if it's a quotation, you of course need a citation. Anything that comes from somewhere else needs a citation. It doesn't matter how it appears in your writing. If the ideas did not originate in your own head, or even if they did, but you need to corroborate it because it's not common knowledge, you need to provide citation information. It is very crucial. That's another reason that we see students for violations is they were not diligent enough in keeping track of all of their citations and either had incorrect formatting, so they weren't following the citation styles, or they just forgot to put the information that they needed. But anyway, here we have examples of each. So a summary, we have in his book, The Origin of Species, Darwin explains that living things will not survive if they can't adapt. So we've taken this entire book, The Origin of Species, and boiled it down to a single sentence summary of the main idea. In the paraphrase, we've shown you the original quote and then how we paraphrase the material. So according to the scientists, quote, the results will not generate trustworthy outcomes because the data has been corrupted. We took that quote and we paraphrased it into the following. The researchers concluded that the findings will not be accurate due to unreliable data. Now you'll notice that there are some similar words in there, but they are not in the same order. And while the idea, the content of that is the same, we can read that and say, oh, that reflects the same idea. We don't see the patterns of the wording in the same way. The only words that are really the same in here are will not and then data, which single words aren't necessarily considered plagiarism unless it's a word specifically coined by your author, but even then a single word would generally not meet the standards of plagiarism. That's usually 3 or more words in sequence. Same with will not. That's not a phrase that's owned by anyone. You're allowed to use will not. But so hopefully you can see the extent to which you need to paraphrase material so that it is considered sufficient and won't trigger plagiarism violations. And then in a quotation you see here in his famous speech, MLK said, I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted. And you see the quotation marks around it with the citation at the end, in this case with the date because it was a spoken speech. But depending on the type of source, you'll have different citation requirements. So some further advice on how to avoid plagiarism in your writing. Firstly, whenever possible, try to use what we call a running acknowledgement. This is a phrase where you are using the context of the source to introduce it. Basically, all that means is something like, according to Johnson, yada yada, or as Dr. Stephen Hawking said, quote. It's providing the author's name to introduce the fact that you're about to present information from their source. Whenever possible, you should do that because it will help you know when you're using source information so you follow through with citations, but also it will help your reader know, hey, we're about to learn about some citation information here. So you practice using that whenever you're able to. It's also important to provide at least 2 or 3 sentences of explanation for every sentence of quoted material. In the Learning Hub, we have multiple handouts on what we call the evidence cycle, or the AEC, and this is a process by which you bring in support from outside sources and then discuss it to help make sure that it is embedded within your writing and supports the main ideas you're trying to get across. If you just pull in source after source after source with no breathing room between them and no assistance from you for your reader as far as how the ideas connect between the sources, it's not really your paper at that point, is it? It's just a collection of material from sources. So to make it your paper and your argument, your discussion, you need to use those sources and plant them specifically in your writing so that you're making your points clear. Make sure you are citing everything, all summaries, paraphrases, and quotations when you include that material in your work. There are some guidelines with depending on the citation style you're using where you can only use a page number the next time if you're citing the same source later. Or you can shorten how you provide citation information or put the citation information in different places. If you're not very practiced with that, I would recommend checking out our citation resources. We have workshops on MLA and APA style, handouts on MLA, APA, and Chicago style, and we're happy to do one-on-one appointments to help you feel more secure in using citation styles and those different formatting requirements. But until you're very comfortable with it, it's just best to cite everything every time and just not mess with it. Don't invite the plagiarism gods. To help you do this, it is very crucial that you develop a note-taking system. Mine, I like to describe when I've collected sources and I plan to write a paper, so I have 5 or 6 sources and I'm writing a short paper. I will read through those sources, and as I'm reading those sources, I have a Word document open on my computer where I've put basic citation information. Either I do the work and I put the full citation there, or I put enough information that I recognize the source, like the author and the title. And I have that open, and as I read through each source, I pick out quotes or sections that I think are really important for what I'm trying to write about. There are often, you'll notice when you're trying to include source information that the whole article is not always relevant. Sometimes there's a section or there's that one quote that says the thing that you need it to say. So I will take those parts and I will copy and paste them into this separate Word document along with the page number information so I don't lose track of where it was in the source. And I just collect it, and then source after source I've just got my collection of materials from that source that I think are useful or connect in some way to the topic I'm writing about. And then once I've done that for all of my sources, I have this collection of source information, potential paraphrases and quotes that I might use. And I keep that open as I write my paper in a separate Word document. So I open a new Word document and then I start writing. And as I go, I'll say, oh, okay, at this point, this is where that quote from Johnson would be really important. So then I'll embed it there. And having this note-taking document open, I have the source information and the page number information for where it came from, so I can go ahead and format the quote however I need to, change it into a paraphrase if I need to. I have everything I need to make that happen. I don't have to go back and hunt through my sources to try to figure out where that information came from. If you don't have a good note-taking system like that, it doesn't have to be exactly that, but if you don't have a good note-taking system and you don't cite as you go, some students tell me that they wait until the end to put in their citations, and that stresses me out because you can easily lose track of where you put your source information, where it came from, even what is source information in your paper, let alone where it came from, putting the right citation information there. And that is just inviting your professor to discover that you forgot citation information or you forgot formatting. And unintentional or intentional, it doesn't matter, it's still plagiarism. So do the little bit of extra work that it takes from the front end to get those citations in there and to do everything correctly. Don't submit work to multiple classes, don't self-plagiarize, and perhaps most importantly, the primary way to avoid plagiarism is to ask when you have questions. If you're not sure if your professor's okay with you quoting or if they just want you to paraphrase, ask them. If you're not sure if a source that you're using is appropriate for the assignment that you've been asked to write, ask your professor. If you're not sure if you're doing everything you need to do to format your citations correctly, to paraphrase sufficiently, come into the Learning Hub, make an appointment with us, and we will be that safety net. As I mentioned, we don't turn students in for plagiarism. We will help you discover what's going on and what you need to do to fix it, and we'll help talk you through that process. So if you do nothing else, ask questions. From this point, this is the end of our workshop, but I would encourage you to check out our website. We have our link to make an appointment if you would like to do so, but we also have lots of other good resources such as handouts on different writing topics. We have two different handouts on the materials we covered in this workshop. We have one on the academic integrity policy and one on the avoiding plagiarism specific information. We have lots of other good help for citation resources and research, use of research materials to check out. I would also make sure that I was familiar with the academic integrity website. This is the link to the policy. Again, it's a short document, and making sure you understand it and the ins and outs of it will take you one step closer to not getting into hot water in the future as you continue with your coursework. Like any good presentation, we're citing our sources, so these are the materials we use to inform our workshop. But at this point, I thank you for joining me for this workshop. Please contact us if you have any questions, and have a great rest of your day.